a priori and a posteriori knowledge in Kantian philosophy. Immanuel Kant's distinction between a priori and a posteriori knowledge is foundational in his Critique of Pure Reason, 1781. This division helps us understand the structure of human cognition and its limits, categorizing knowledge based on its acquisition, either independently of experience, a priori, or through experience, a posteriori. Definition: a priori knowledge is knowledge that is independent of sensory experience. It is universal, necessary, and cannot be derived from the empirical world. This type of knowledge is grounded in the mind's inherent structures or logical truths that do not require empirical verification. Key characteristics: independent of experience, a priori knowledge does not depend on any particular experience to be known. Necessity: it holds universally and cannot be otherwise, it is not contingent on circumstances. Universality: a priori knowledge is true for all rational beings, regardless of time or place. Examples: mathematics: the statement 2 plus 2 equals 4 is universally true, independent of specific instances. It does not require empirical verification. Logic: the principle of non-contradiction states that a proposition cannot be both true and false at the same time, for example, A cannot be both A and not A. This is universally true without requiring observation. Quote from Kant: "Though all our knowledge begins with experience, it does not follow that it all arises out of experience." Critique of Pure Reason, preface to the second edition. This illustrates that while knowledge may originate from experience, foundational structures exist independently. Philosophical relevance. A priori knowledge is crucial in fields like mathematics, logic, and metaphysics, providing foundational principles that do not require empirical evidence. It shapes how we make sense of the world in a coherent manner. Definition: a posteriori knowledge is derived from sensory experience. It is contingent on empirical observation and can vary based on individual experiences. Unlike a priori knowledge, a posteriori knowledge is not necessary or universal, it relies on particular instances. Key characteristics: dependent on experience, a posteriori knowledge is gained through observation and sensory input. Contingency: the truth of a posteriori claims depends on specific empirical conditions and could be otherwise. Particularity: it applies to specific cases and may not hold in all circumstances. Examples: scientific observations: the statement water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level is a posteriori knowledge, based on empirical observations. It is contingent on environmental factors like atmospheric pressure. Historical facts: Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE is known through historical records and is contingent on empirical sources. Quote from Kant: "All knowledge which is empirical is a posteriori, that is, knowledge that is possible only a posteriori, or through experience." Critique of Pure Reason, a 2. This clarifies that a posteriori knowledge is gained through sensory experience. Philosophical relevance. A posteriori knowledge is central to empirical sciences and everyday understanding. It enables comprehension of contingent facts about the world. For Kant, a posteriori knowledge alone cannot explain the fundamental structure of experience, which must be rooted in a priori principles. Kant synthesizes a priori and a posteriori knowledge, arguing that both are necessary to understand the world. A priori knowledge provides the structural framework to organize sensory data, while a posteriori knowledge supplies the content through which we interact with the world. Example: the concept of causality is an a priori category that the mind applies to experience. To understand specific instances of causality, for example, one billiard ball striking another, we need a posteriori sensory input from the empirical world. Kant famously referred to this synthesis as a Copernican revolution in philosophy. Just as Copernicus posited that the Earth revolves around the Sun, Kant argued that knowledge conforms to the mind's structures rather than the mind passively conforming to external objects. Quote from Kant: "Concepts without intuitions are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind." Critique of Pure Reason, A51/B75. This summarizes Kant's view that a priori concepts need the raw material of experience to be meaningful, just as sensory experience requires the mind's conceptual framework for understanding. A priori example in daily life. When discussing the rules of logic, you might state, if it is raining, it must be wet outside. This conclusion uses a priori knowledge, as it relies on logical reasoning without needing to verify the weather. A posteriori example in daily life. While planning a picnic, you check the weather forecast to see if it will rain. This knowledge is a posteriori, as it depends on sensory information gathered through empirical observation. Kant's distinction between a priori and a posteriori knowledge, while groundbreaking, has faced significant criticisms and refinements from subsequent philosophers. David Hume, an empiricist, challenged the idea that a priori knowledge could provide genuine insights about the world. Hume contended that all knowledge derives from experience, including causal principles. He argued that causality is not an inherent a priori structure but a habit of thought formed through repeated experiences. Quote from Hume: "All the objects of human reason or inquiry may naturally be divided into two kinds, relations of ideas, and matters of fact, an inquiry concerning human understanding." 1748. Hume categorizes mathematical truths, similar to Kant's a priori, as relations of ideas while asserting that matters of fact, empirical observations, are learned through experience. He thus rejects the necessity of a priori concepts like Kant's categories of understanding. In the 20th century, logical positivists criticized Kant's distinction, particularly regarding his a priori metaphysical claims. They argued that meaningful statements are either analytic, a priori truths that are tautological, or synthetic statements that can be empirically verified, a posteriori. They rejected Kant's assertion of synthetic a priori judgments, like causality, which Kant believed were essential for structuring experience. Quote from A.J. Ayer: "No proposition, other than a tautology, can possibly be necessary or self-evident. Language, Truth, and Logic," 1936. Ayer's statement rejects the notion that metaphysical a priori claims, such as those proposed by Kant, hold cognitive meaning beyond analytic propositions. Kant's distinction between a priori and a posteriori knowledge is foundational to his critical philosophy. For Kant, a priori knowledge constitutes the necessary conditions for experience, while a posteriori knowledge provides the empirical content. Without a priori concept, the world would appear as a chaotic array of sensations. Without a posteriori knowledge, our a priori structures would lack material to organize. In essence, Kant's distinction highlights that the mind is not a passive recipient of information but actively shapes how we perceive the world. This framework underscores the balance between reason and experience, forming the basis for Kant's later work on ethics and aesthetics. Kant's distinction between phenomena and noumena is central to his theory of transcendental idealism, addressing the limits of human knowledge. In essence, phenomena are things as they appear to us, while noumena are things as they are in themselves, independent of our perception. Kant's theory emphasizes that human cognition is inherently limited. We can only know appearances, not the intrinsic nature of reality. Definition: phenomena are the objects and events as we perceive and experience them. They are the sensory experiences that our minds organize and interpret through innate categories such as time, space, and causality. Key characteristics: mediated by perception, phenomena are not things in themselves but how things appear through our senses and mental frameworks. Structured by categories, the mind imposes a priori structures on sensory data, allowing us to make sense of phenomena. Dependent on human cognition, phenomena exist in relation to our perceptual faculties and are shaped by them. Example: when observing a tree, the height, color, and texture that you perceive are part of the phenomenal world. What you experience is the tree as it appears to you, not as it exists independently of your perception. Quote from Kant. We can have cognition of no object as a thing in itself, but only insofar as it is an object of sensible intuition, that is, as phenomenon. Critique of Pure Reason, A 253. Everyday relevance. In daily life, everything we interact with is a phenomenon. Our experiences of color, sound, and taste depend on our sensory apparatus, illustrating that we engage with phenomena rather than the essence of things as they exist independently. Definition. Noumena refer to things in themselves, Ding and Zik, the reality that exists independently of our perception. Noumena represent the true nature of objects, which remains inaccessible to human knowledge due to our limitation to experiencing the phenomenal world. Key characteristics. Beyond human cognition, noumena exist independently of our senses, meaning we cannot perceive or know them directly. Inaccessible by sensory experience, noumena cannot be known through empirical means because our senses are limited to perceiving appearances. Theoretical concept. Kant uses the noumenal realm to describe ultimate reality, which we cannot know directly. Example. Returning to the tree example, while we perceive its characteristics as phenomena, the tree as it exists independently, its true essence and properties, is a noumenon. We can never know what the tree is like in itself, we only know it as it appears to us. Quote from Kant. A noumenon, therefore, is not an object of our sensible intuition, and since we cannot have any intuition but sensible, it is impossible for us to know whether such an object can even be possible. Critique of Pure Reason, B 310. Everyday relevance. Although we cannot access the noumenal world directly, recognizing its existence encourages humility about the limits of human knowledge. In science, for example, we observe phenomena, such as light or biological processes, but we must acknowledge that our understanding is limited to how these phenomena appear, not necessarily how they really are in themselves. Kant's philosophy centers on the idea that we can never access noumena directly. He emphasizes that human cognition is structured by a priori categories, such as space and time, which shape our experiences. While these categories enable us to understand phenomena, they also limit our access to the noumenal reality beyond them. Transcendental idealism. Kant's theory posits that we can only know appearances, phenomena, structured by the mind's inherent categories. The noumenal realm exists but is beyond human cognition. Quote from Kant. I had therefore to remove knowledge, in order to make room for belief. Critique of Pure Reason, BXXX. Kant's aim was to limit human knowledge to phenomena, allowing space for the noumenal realm, which can be the subject of faith or belief, for example, moral laws, freedom, or God. Kant provides several illustrative examples to clarify the distinction between phenomena and noumena. Mathematics and space. Kant argues that space and time are not features of the noumenal world but rather categories that the mind imposes on sensory experience. We perceive all phenomena as existing in space and time, however, we cannot assume that space and time exist independently of our perception. Cause and effect. Similarly, causality is an a priori category of understanding that we apply to phenomena. For instance, when one billiard ball hits another, we perceive the first ball causing the second to move. This notion of cause and effect is a structure imposed by the mind, which does not necessarily apply to the noumenal realm beyond our perception. Kant's distinction between phenomena and noumena has profound implications for how we approach knowledge and reality in everyday life. In science, Kant's distinction serves as a reminder that scientific inquiry is bound by the limits of human cognition. While we observe and measure phenomena, the underlying reality, noumena, may remain hidden. For example, physicists can study the behavior of subatomic particles, but the true nature of these particles may elude us, constrained by the tools and concepts we use to measure them. In ethics and religion, Kant's assertion that the noumenal realm is unknowable allows for the possibility of free will, moral law, and even the existence of God, concepts that cannot be proven or disproven by empirical means. This leaves space for faith and moral reasoning in a world where empirical science cannot provide all the answers. In personal life. On a personal level, the distinction invites reflection on whether we can ever truly know others or ourselves. We perceive individuals through their actions and words, phenomena, but their inner selves, noumena, may remain unknowable. Similarly, our own motivations and desires might not always be fully transparent, highlighting limits to self